Well, it's good to be back, seeing a lot of familiar faces. I'm not going to go around the room, though, even though I'm tempted to, and start calling people by... Don, don't smile at me like that. Mr. and Mrs. Fisher, I remember you folk, too. And, of course, Christopher. No, it's great to see you all. And so many of you are very familiar to me. I hope through the course of the day that I'll know all of your names. It's kind of funny. I was down in Santa Clara, California recently, and there was a little 8-year-old girl, and she and her parents were introduced to me for the first time, and I thought, you know, children sometimes in meetings, they're kind of like, you know, what would you say, wallflowers? They just kind of disappear into the woodwork. So I remembered her name specifically. It was Abigail. And during the course of the first meeting, it was appropriate. And so I mentioned her name. And, you know, she just looked stunned. Just stunned. So, yeah, it's important. It's important to me to... get to know at least your names. So hopefully that'll happen through the course of the day. Pastor Al, of course, had the opening prayer. So we're going to look this morning at probably something that's, I mean, it's just huge in Seventh-day Adventism today. And of course, the old saying, you put your money where your mouth is. So, you know, I've shared with different folk in different locales. I shared it in Santa Clara recently, and I've shared it on many of our YouTube videos, that today as a people, we are either supporting the work of God, which is the three angels' messages of Revelation chapter 14, or we are funding the setting up of the image of the beast in Seventh-day Adventism. You know, a lot of people, they just, that just infuriates them when I say that. But folk, it's the truth. You know, what we're going to look at this afternoon, it's called Diop again. Gwynune Diop is one of the highest officials in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and he is promoting ecumenism all over the world. And in his efforts to promote ecumenism, he is promoting the watering down and the elimination of what we believe as a people. So, folk, we're either supporting one or the other. And that's something, you know, it used to be where, you know, we'd say, well, you know, I'm just going to put my money in. I'm not going to look. And, you know, that's between them and the Lord. No, folk. It's not between the conference brethren and the Lord. It's between you and the Lord. You are responsible. You are accountable for where your money goes. And so it behooves all of us that wherever we're putting our money, that we know what that person and or that organization or that church, what they stand for. You know, again, folk, this idea, well, you know, I'm just going to put it in there. It doesn't matter. It's their responsibility now. No, it's our responsibility. And... you know, some of the crazy things that are coming out of the mouths of professing present truth Adventists, it's just shocking. You know, I heard a recent talk, and I'm sure we'll discuss more of this in the Q&A this afternoon, but Ivor Myers, the gentleman down, I think he's in California, I think he's in Central Cal actually, but Ivor Myers was telling people, you know, we've got to support the denomination because they're the voice of God on this earth. And I'm going, You know, Ellen White talked about the General Conference being the voice of God. But folk, look at the time frame in which she made those statements. She made those statements from the early or middle of the 1860s when the denomination was incorporated up until the death of her husband in the early 1880s. But folk, as you go through the 1880s, into the 1890s, into the 1900s, Ellen White made statements where she said anyone who would dare to say that the General Conference is the voice of God, she says that's blasphemy. So folk, if that was blasphemy in the late 1880s, 1890s, into the 1900s, what would it be today? Come on. This is... Thank you. It's mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling. So folk, if one of us finds ourselves supporting Ivor Myers, you're going to support that? Well, we are all free agents, and you can put your money wherever you want to. That's totally between you and God. But folk, we have a responsibility. And the more that things are coming out, we've got to know. We've got to know. As we see things going on in the world and in the among God's professed people, folk, we are rapidly coming to a time when the judgment of the living is going to begin. And we know Ellen White in 7th A of the Bible Commentary, her comments, I believe it's on Revelation 13. She says that the final test for the people of God will be the setting up of the image of the beast. Well, folk, the image of the beast is set up when the Sunday law comes, and we see that unfolding rapidly before our eyes. I don't want to have my name come up in the judgment of the living, and I'm supporting garbage. I don't want to be in that position. And I wouldn't think that you would want to be in that position either. So, anyway, let's take a look. We get so many voices today about the Storehouse, and, the Storehouse is the denomination, and we've got to put our money in the Storehouse. Folk, the next time you hear that, look at the person square in the eyes and say, you're a liar. You're a liar. Because that could not be further from the truth. It couldn't be further from the truth. We're going to see it today. 1868, 5 years after the denomination has become an organization, a woman by the name of Hannah More came back from missionary work. She had become a Seventh-day Adventist. And Hannah More died because she had no sustentation because the church that she had been a part of cut off her funds, and Seventh-day Adventists did not help her. So Ellen White was furious and heartbroken that this woman died because Adventists didn't help her. So Ellen White started appropriating her own funds, tithes and offerings, to needy, worthy, self-supporting individuals who were receiving no support from the General Conference. Not only was she using her means for these purposes, but also from monies given to her by others. She was bypassing the denomination and giving the means directly to self-supporting workers who were spreading the truth. Now, folk, I didn't pull that out of some magical hat somewhere. Go back and read. Go back and read Adventist history. Get the book by Vance Farrell called The Truth About Tithe. Get the book, friends. If you can't get it, you say, too much, I can't afford it. Fine, send me an email. My email's in3232@cs.com. Send me an email and say, Bill, send me the book, The Truth About Tithe by Vance Farrell. I'll send it to you. I'll send it to you. Read the book, folks, because this is what Ellen White did for the last nearly 50 years of her life. She didn't put the money in the denomination. She supported white ministers, black ministers, predominantly in the South, because the denomination was doing nothing following the Civil War. They did nothing. In fact, in the early 1890s, that's 25 years after the Civil War ended, Ellen White gave a sermon in which she absolutely castigated the denomination because they were doing nothing, absolutely nothing in the South. She said, we have these people that have been enslaved for so long, and you are doing nothing to proclaim the truth. She was livid with the brethren. It's in a little booklet called The Southern Work. Get the book, folk, read it. That's what Ellen White did with her tithes and offerings. And a lot of people, think about it. Here's a woman living who had visions of heaven. Here's a woman who would be seeing great controversy themes going on. And people would walk up to her in the midst of great crowds of people in churches, and they'd go, and her eyelids wouldn't flip one moment. They would go up and put their hand in front of her mouth. She would not breathe. She would hold her hand out like this, her arm, with a Bible that weighed 18 pounds. And people are going, there's something going on with that lady. People were deeply impressed. My, she is a living prophet? I'm going to give her my tithes and offerings. I'm going to let her do with them what she thinks is best. So, folk, many people did that. Did Ellen White then take those monies, as many quote-unquote self-supporting Adventist ministers do today, and say, I've got to send it on to the brethren because they've got to handle all the tithe? Hogwash. Ellen White took those tithes and offerings that people gave to her, and she sent them to the southern field. That's what she did. Well, that caused some problem. There were several workers in the Lord's vineyard who were carrying on a worthy work in the southern states, of which Ellen White heartily approved. Among them that did that, does anybody know the young man that built a great big boat and went down to the south and raised up a number of Adventist schools, among which was Oakwood College? Do you know who did that? Edson White. That's right. Edson White and Will Palmer, they built this great big boat. It was called the Morning Star. They went down the Mississippi. They're handing out tracts all along the way. They're going to Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, and they're raising up schools and Adventist churches. They were doing a great work. And Ellen White said, you guys are worthy of tithes and offerings. Now, it wasn't just Edson White and Will Palmer. There were many black Seventh-day Adventist pastors that were working for the Lord, but the brethren didn't give them a dime. So Ellen White said, fine, I'll support them directly. This work continued on for several years, was receiving financial backing from Ellen White, and others because the denomination did not feel the work was worthy of funding. You know, when I was in Santa Clara recently, there was a couple, nice folks. They said, we're going to some meetings that Ted Wilson's going to be having next week in San Francisco. I said, oh, really? I said, you need to be sure to ask him some point-blank questions. I said, ask him about Diop. Ask him about his flip-flopping over what the mark of the beast was. Ask him about Ellen White's use of the tithe and the fact that she bypassed the denomination and gave it straight to self-supporting workers. I said, ask him about that. Well, they did. Ted Wilson got real upset with them. Had to come back later on and apologize for his behavior. When they asked Ted Wilson, what about how Ellen White bypassed the denomination and gave the money directly to self-supporting workers? Can you imagine what Ted Wilson said? Folk, he said, that was only for her day. That doesn't apply now. Oh, really? It doesn't apply now? The apostasy today, friends, is 100 times worse than it was in the time of Ellen White. 100 times worse. Do you know who the first self-supporting ministry in Seventh-day Adventism, do you know what it was called? Somebody tell me. Madison, that's right. Just outside of Nashville, Tennessee, a college, a school, a sanitarium started right there, just outside of Nashville. Who was the person who started self-supporting ministries when Ellen White was alive? Do you know who started Madison? Okay, Sutherland and McGann. Now, who pushed them to do it? Ellen White pushed the starting of self-supporting ministry. Why? Because the denomination absolutely stunk up the educational work. They made it stink, friends. They made it just like the world. Just like the world. Ellen White said, that's it. We're going to have a school that is according to the way God intended it to be. She started Madison College. You think Ellen White hasn't been the inspiration because of her example for self-supporting ministry today, friends? Friends, I could name you probably a half a dozen to a dozen people, i.e. ministries, in the last 30 to 40 years that were raised up because the denomination was in such bold-faced apostasy, and these men had been booted out of the church, and they loved the truth so much they said, we're going to carry on the work by ourselves. You think God doesn't have his hand in that, friends? So it was only for her day, huh? Nice try, Ted. Nice try. In her letters to these workers, Ellen White counseled them to appeal directly to church members for funds, since church leaders refused to honor their requests for funds or even admit publicly that they existed. Ellen White said to these white and black pastors and self-supporting workers, she said, go right to the churches. Go to Adventist churches. Ask them for funds. You're doing the work. You're doing the work. You're spreading the three angels' messages. You deserve the money. And so that's what they did. They started going different places. The ostracized workers began writing directly to church members for help. In addition, in 1904, Several of them traveled as far west as Colorado. In several meetings in these Adventist churches in Colorado, they told what they were doing and spoke of their needs, just as Ellen White told them to do. Among the donations they received was tithe money. Oh, they bypassed the storehouse. Oh, shame on them. Returning to their area of labor, they spent the funds. The faithful workers were carrying on their ministry in accordance with Spirit of Prophecy counsel, and they deserved the encouragement and support which church leaders did not wish to grant them. So what happened? Oh my. In comes G.F. Watson, the Colorado Conference president, and when he heard about it, friends, he blew a gasket. He was livid. They took money that should have come into our conference? They took money that should have come in to our conference so I could buy a nicer horse? Or I could live in a nicer house? Shame on those people. How dare they do that? Watson was livid, folks. He was livid. He learned about the giving of tithe to these workers and that members of his conference had given it. He was furious, feeling that all the tithe produced by Colorado Conference church members belonged to him. That was in 1904, friends. How do you think it is today? Ted Wilson has a PhD. He's a bright man. Intellectually, he's a bright man. Why would he dare to tell those folk in Santa Clara that only applied for her day? He knew very well it applied to now, 10 times more than it did back then. Why did he say that, friend? Because he wanted to make sure all the money comes into the denomination so that he can pad his $190 million, what he's worth. Yeah, he's worth over $190 million, folks. Yeah. Wants to make sure the funds are padded in the denomination. Without stopping to consider that God was well able to continue caring for his work in Colorado, even while at the same time impressing some of its members to help support a needed work elsewhere, Elder Watson fired off an angry letter to those workers in the South. He told them that since they were not denominationally employed workers, were operating an independent ministry. What audacity those people had. Starting a self-supporting... Wow. And had not received their funds through regular church... I don't even know if I can read the... Pastor Al, you may need to have to come up and read. This is just... Can you imagine? They dared to take money that belonged to G.F. Watson? They were not entitled to receive funds from on-the-roll Seventh-day Adventist church members. Their activities had not been approved by the Finance Committee of the Colorado Conference. Didn't approve of what those people were doing. The audacity of these people. The audacity of these self-supporting workers in the South who wanted to see the three angels' messages go to the people of the South The audacity to take money that should have gone into Elder Watson's treasuries. Elder Watson felt he owned the church members in his territory, at least that he had authority to override their convictions and decisions. I mean, come on, the people are goyim, right? They're human cattle. That's how people in leadership, in churches and in government, that's how they view people like us. We're human cattle. Doesn't that make you feel good? They look at us folk as, you know how cattle, when they're going for the slaughter, all they do is they follow the cow that's right in front of them. They don't think about the fact that they're closed in. They don't think about that there's no way out. All they're concerned about is that animal in front of them. And that's how they view us. We can't think for ourselves. We can't have convictions. We can't make decisions. Doesn't that make you feel good? That's how they look at us, folk. I don't appreciate being looked at like that. Well, there was a showdown of sorts. I want you to notice the players in this showdown. It's between the Colorado Conference president, which so many people would say, well, that's the voice of God. That's the voice of God. And these raggedy, self-supporting workers who were doing a mighty work in the South. And the God of heaven stepped in. You say, well, it's obvious what the God of heaven said. I mean, these audacious, rabble-rousing upstarts from the South had no right to the money. And since Elder Watson was the voice of God, then clearly God would come in on his side. I mean, that's the obvious, isn't it? Of course, the Lord stepped in on the side of the denomination. Of course he did. Of course he rebuked the self-supporting ministries for receiving monies that bypassed the conference treasuries. Now listen to the letter that was written by Ellen White. This is what she said. Elder Watson, my brother. Wasn't she gracious? Wasn't she so kind? My brother, she said. My brother. I wish to say to you, be careful how you move. You are not moving wisely. The least you have to speak about the tithe that has been appropriated to the most needy and the most discouraging field in the world, the more sensible you will be. Again, how gracious she was. It has been presented to me for years that my tithe was to be appropriated by myself to aid the white and colored ministers who were neglected and did not receive sufficient properly to support their families. When my attention was called to aged ministers, white and black, it was my special duty to investigate into their necessities and supply their needs. This was to be my special work, and I have done this in a number of cases. No man should give notoriety to the fact that in special cases the tithe is used in this way. Elder Watson, you need to be quiet. Isn't it interesting that the voice of God that came down through the spirit of prophecy, the voice of God was telling the voice of God to keep his mouth shut. Isn't that interesting? The voice of God was telling the voice. You know, there's something wrong with that picture, isn't there? There's something distorted about that picture. The voice of God came down through the spirit of prophecy. Brother Watson wasn't the voice of God, was he? He was the voice of selfishness. Now, I'm not going to be as gracious as Ellen White was. I think we could fairly say the voice of God was telling the voice of the devil, keep your mouth shut. In regard to the colored work in the South, that field has been and is still being robbed of the means that should come to the workers of that field. If there have been cases where our sisters have appropriated their tithe to the support of the ministers working for the colored people in the South, let every man, if he is wise, hold his peace. Now wait a minute. There were men and women either gave their tithes and offerings to Ellen White that she then appropriated for the Southern work predominantly, or these faithful Seventh-day Adventists sent the money directly to the South to support these people. Now, did Ellen White, in her comments here, did she say anything against them because they bypassed the storehouse? Did you hear her say that? I didn't either. Do you think Ellen White understood what the storehouse was? I think she did. Do you think she understood it better than G.F. Watson? Yeah, I think she did. Roy, would you say that just a little bit louder?
She understood it better than Ted Wilson does, too.
Ellen White understood the storehouse better than Ted Wilson and Gwynune Diop and Ivor Myers and Stephen Bohr and Mark Finley and all these other people that are making a mockery of the storehouse. She goes on. I have myself appropriated my tithe to the most needy cases brought to my notice. I have been instructed to do this. And as the money is not withheld from the Lord's treasury, excuse me? Ellen White said she was sending money directly to Southern workers. She said, I have not withheld it from the Lord's treasury. Did she just say that the Lord's treasury is where people are doing the work of promoting the three angels' messages and they need support? Is that what she just said? That's what she just said. So all these guys, well, I remember back in the fall of 2010, Ted Wilson was now the General Conference president, and he gave a sermon called Remember Your Name. And in the sermon, he listed about 7 or 8 different groups of people that he said needed to remember that they were Seventh-day Adventists and they needed to unite with the church. One of those groups were self-supporting ministries. And the comments he made was, he said, for those of you in self-supporting ministries, you need to get together with your local conference, tell all the people that support you to put their money, their tithes, into the denominational storehouse. You know what I call that, friends? That's a lie. That is a bold-faced lie. Because the same demonic spirit that inspired Watson is inspiring Wilson and all the other Adventist cronies who are lying to Adventist people that there's only one storehouse, and that's the church. And that's a bold-faced lie. Ellen White said it, folks. The money is not withheld from the Lord's treasury. It is not a matter that should be commented upon. Well, how many leaders today in Adventism, put it in the storehouse. Make sure it goes in the storehouse. Don't forget to pay your tithe, but get it to the storehouse. Adventist leaders today are obsessed. They are obsessed, friends, to make sure they get the money. And then when they don't, who do they blame for the lack of money that comes in? They blame self-supporting workers who are doing the work, friends, who are doing the work. It will necessitate my making known these matters, which I do not desire to do, because it is not best. If any person shall say to me, Sister White, will you appropriate my tithe where you know it is most needed? I shall say, yes, I will, and I have done so. I commend those sisters. Excuse me? These sisters didn't put the money they put it into the storehouse, didn't they? Which was where the work of God was being done. I send this matter to you so that you shall not make a mistake. Circumstances alter cases. I would not advise that any should make a practice of gathering up the tithe money. What does she mean by that? Don't open a bank account at your bank where you do your banking, and don't start dumping your tithe and putting it into that account. Don't do that. Get the tithe, put it where the work of God is being done, friends. For years, there have now and then been persons who have lost confidence in the appropriation of the tithe. Boy, that was even true back in 1904. Who had placed the tithe in my hands and said that if I did not take it, they would themselves appropriate it to the families of the most needy minister they could find. I've taken the money, given a receipt for it, and told them how it was appropriated. I write this to you so that you shall keep cool and not become stirred up and give publicity to this matter, lest many more shall follow this example. Signed, Ellen White. Ellen White letter, January 22, 1905. It's letter 267, 1905, to Elder G.F. Watson. It's in Spalding McGann, Unpublished Testimonies, pages 215 and 216. The workers in the South were heeding the counsel of Ellen White and seeking to share the truth there. We will look at the southern situation. Okay, that's the next part. The situation in the South became very personal to Ellen White because it was her son Edson who spearheaded the work there. Well, what did we learn from the Watson letter? Number one, Ellen White used tithe money to support self-supporting workers. For years, she bypassed the denominational lines and sent it directly to worthy workers in the vineyard. Number two, she basically told the Colorado Conference president to keep his mouth shut on the issue. Those who gave Ellen White their tithe funds were doing a worthy work, as this aided needy white and black workers. And Ted Wilson a few weeks ago had the audacity to say, well, that doesn't apply today. Really? It's 100 times worse today. By bypassing the denominational headquarters, Ellen White declared the funds were still going to the Lord's treasury. The headquarters of the work is not, I repeat, the denominational headquarters of the denomination is not the storehouse. Ellen White appropriated her tithe and the tithes of others for helping self-supporting workers and their families. Was Ellen White, did she play games? I think that's the furthest thing that I would think of when I think of Ellen White. She had one burning desire: the promoting of the three angels' messages throughout the world. That's all she cared about. That's all she cared about. And she was going to use her tithes and offerings and the tithes and offerings of others to support those who were sharing those messages. That's what she was going to do. She told the conference president to zip it, or more would follow her example. Folks, Ellen White gave a perfect example during her time in raising up self-supporting ministries and workers through Madison and then other work and other entities. And then by showing, by her example, the appropriation of her tithes and offerings to support self-supporting ministry. Ellen White did not believe the conference was the storehouse. She did not feel that she or anyone else was required to pay their tithes and offerings to the conference. She bypassed the denominational coffers for decades to support worthy, self-supporting workers whom the denomination disdained. In 1898, a Seventh-day Adventist by the name of M.E. Kellogg, in a book called The Supremacy of Peter, pages 269 and 270. This M.E. Kellogg is not the famous Adventist doctor. That was J.H. Kellogg. He wrote a book, again, The Supremacy of Peter. And he said in one chapter in the New Testament church government, thank you, Al, we find a comparison between the New Testament church and the church at Rome. Kellogg maintained that the Roman Catholic concept of an exclusive central storehouse was foreign to the New Testament church. Isn't that interesting? The concept of an exclusive central storehouse is not biblical. The idea of a central storehouse came in during the Dark Ages. Surprise, surprise. Surprise, surprise. The papacy, in their lust for greed and gain and wealth and power, said, oh, there's only one storehouse. You got to put your money into the storehouse. The church at Philippi at one time took upon itself the task of supporting the Apostle Paul, sending to him by a special messenger money or other means when he was in distant lands. Philippians 4:15. No doubt other churches did the same. These are specimens of apostolic practice before the rigid rules of a hierarchy had crushed all the spontaneous life and liberty out of the church. Think about, friends, go back for a moment. You're in the 16th century, you're about 1522, and you've got this rabble-rouser in, in Wittenberg. His name was Martin Luther. And Luther, by his stand at Worms, was turning the world of Europe upside down. And so there were some folk that said, hey, this guy's doing the work. This guy resonates with my own heart. He's doing what I love, and I'm going to support him. And you know what the papacy said? The papacy came along and said, oh no, you can't support Luther. You've got to put your funds into the storehouse. It's been going on, folks, for a long time. And the fact that the denomination today, in order to save as much wealth as they can, to continue to promulgate an organization that is not doing what they're supposed to be doing. They have to say, you have to give it to a central storehouse. Paul was a self-supporting minister. John the Baptist, Jesus, were all self-supporting ministers. I want you to think for a moment, and we're going to close here soon. In the first century, what was the storehouse? What was the storehouse in the first century? It was the temple in Jerusalem, wasn't it? Okay, so here's the central storehouse in Jerusalem. You got to put your money right there. But along comes a self-supporting ministry. And did you realize that self-supporting ministry had a treasurer? Do you know what that treasurer's name was? His name was Judas. That's right. And you remember the story at the Feast of Simon's house in Luke chapter 7? Judas said, why all this waste? Why did you buy this expensive spikenard to anoint Jesus' feet? We could have used that money to help the poor. Well, the gospel writer says he wasn't doing it to help the poor. He was doing it to pad his own pocket. Well, you know, in the Gospel of John chapter 13, when Judas was about to go out to betray Jesus, John says Judas was carrying the bag. What was the bag for? It was to collect funds, wasn't it? People in the first century were bypassing the denominational storehouse and giving their tithes and offerings to a self-supporting Seventh-day Adventist pastor by the name of Jesus of Nazareth. Now, do you ever remember one time in the Gospels when Jesus said, Judas can no longer be the financier. He can no longer have a bag. We're just going to do this straight off the cuff. Do you remember anywhere in the Gospels where it says that? Jesus, did he understand what the storehouse was? He did, didn't he? And because he was doing the work, he had a treasurer who took care of the funds that came in to their ministry. Boy, we've got a lot of liars walking around here, folks. We've got a lot of people that are out and out, flat out liars. You say, Bill, come on, don't name any names now. Well, I'm glad you said that. Ted Wilson's a liar. He's a liar, folks. And Gwenoon Diop is a liar too. And Mark Finley is a liar. And all the rest of these guys, Ivor Myers, Stephen Bohr, oh, you got to put your money into the storehouse. You're going to tell me in all their education, they don't know what the real storehouse is? And I'm somehow the only one that figured it out? I don't think so. I think somebody's lying. No, I don't think they're lying. I know they're lying. They're lying by the skin of their teeth. How is the money which we put into the treasury being used? Where is the evidence of the co-working with God? 3 Testimonies 5:53. It would be poor policy. It would be poor policy to support from the treasury of God those who really mar and injure His work and who are constantly lowering the standard of Christianity. Poor policy. Do you want God to look down upon you as you are funding Gwenoon Diop to go all over the world in the name of Adventist ecumenism? Do you want to have that on your record? I don't. I don't. I love the truth, folks. I love the truth because, as Jesus said, you will know the truth will set you free. I don't have to be beholden to somebody who's looking me right in the eyes and lying to me. And I can go to bed at night with a free and a peaceful conscience, knowing that I'm not supporting Gwenoon Diop as he flies to Rome in the name of Adventist ecumenism. I'm just thankful today for the great truth that the storehouse is where the Lord's work is being done. And we can support that. Let's kneel for prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we're grateful for your love to us. We're grateful for the beauty of truth. I pray that you would strengthen us to stand in defense of truth and righteousness when the majority forsake us. And please empower us to fight the battles of the Lord when champions are few. Help us, Lord, to pass that test. In Jesus' name, amen.